Picture, if you will, an entire continent standing right on the brink of a tectonic shift. We are about to look at a profoundly cinematic story of two rival monarchs whose deeply contrasting personalities didn't just clash on a battlefield, they completely rewrote the map of Europe. This explainer is the story of the Great Northern War. It's a dramatic saga where the ultimate immovable object meets a truly unstoppable force.
But before we trace the march of these massive armies, I want you to consider a philosophical question. Just think about it for a second. What happens when absolute tactical genius meets relentless adaptability? Which trait actually wins out in the end? Is it the perfection of the present or the willingness to learn for the future?
Okay, let's dive right into this. You see, the Great Northern War was far more than just a series of military campaigns. It was the exact moment in history that fundamentally shifted European supremacy away from the highly militarized Swedish Empire and handed it directly over to a rising, explosive new power, the Russian Empire. This whole conflict is essentially a dramatic dual trajectory of absolute hubris on one side and agonizing, relentless learning on the other.
Act 1. The Clash of Two Empires.
To really understand this clash, we need to set the stage in the year 1700. Sitting on the thrones of these two opposing empires are men who literally could not be more different from one another. Leading the dominant Swedish Empire is Charles XII. He's barely 15 years old, a total tactical prodigy, entirely fearless, yet notoriously rigid. Opposing him is the Russian Tsar, Peter the Great. Now, Peter is ambitious. He's deeply focused on modernizing his fringe empire by westernizing it, and above all else, he is relentlessly observant and adaptive.
Act 2. The Illusion of Invincibility. The spark of this rivalry ignites at the Battle of Narva in November 1700. Now, I really want you to think about a specific number here: 9,000. Charles marched a mere 9,000 men through brutal, freezing weather just to relieve a besieged fort. Staring back at him was a massive, entrenched Russian army of up to 40,000 soldiers. I mean, that is a massive numerical disadvantage. But Charles? He didn't even hesitate. Charles orchestrated an absolute masterclass in tactics. Right as the battle began, the weather suddenly changed. A heavy snow and hailstorm blew directly into the faces of the Russian soldiers. Using this blizzard as a natural screen, Charles ordered his men to fill the Russian trenches with bundles of wood called fascines and literally cross right over them. The Swedes, utilizing their ferocious close-quarters shock combat, descended straight into the trenches. The surprised and completely paralyzed Russian lines collapsed. It was a crushing, totally humiliating defeat for Russia. But for Charles, it cemented a very dangerous belief in his own absolute invincibility.
But listen to how Peter the Great responded to having his army absolutely annihilated. He didn't despair, he didn't give up. Instead, he famously remarked, "They have beaten us, they might beat us again, but in time they will teach us how to beat them." It gives you chills, doesn't it? Peter took a profound military disaster and turned it into a philosophical awakening.
Act 3. The Crucible of Attrition.
Following Narva, Charles had a choice, and he chose to completely ignore the threat in the east. Between 1701 and 1707, we see this fascinating contrast in leadership styles. Charles is rigidly pursuing total political victory, dethroning the Polish Saxon king Augustus and just endlessly campaigning in Poland. Meanwhile, Peter is trading space for time. He is ruthlessly adapting. Oh, he lost his artillery at Narva? No problem. He literally melts down Russian church bells to cast new, modern cannons. He reforms his infantry into a highly credible fighting machine. And at the mouth of the Neva River, he founds his window to the west, St. Petersburg.
Contrast Peter's humble willingness to learn with the mindset of Charles XII. Supremely confident in his veteran army, Charles declared, "I will attack the first to take the field, conquer him, and then deal with the others." I mean, that is the ultimate hubris. By the autumn of 1707, having finally defeated Augustus, Charles turns his invincible army east. He's finally marching directly on Russia.
Let's move along and see how this built, because this hubris leads to an absolute nightmare for the Swedes. In autumn 1707, Charles crosses the Vistula, but Peter refuses to give him the open battle he so desperately wants. Instead, the Russians employ brutal scorched earth tactics, burning crops and destroying shelters. By October 1708, a vital Swedish supply train is intercepted and destroyed at the Battle of Lesnaya. And then, the winter of 1708 to 1709 hits. It was one of the coldest winters in recorded European history.
The Great Frost devastated the Swedes.
By the time spring finally arrived, less than half of Charles' original, formidable army was left standing. Thousands starved to death, succumbed to disease, or simply froze right there in the Russian wasteland.
Act 4. The Fall at Poltava. So it's the summer of 1709. The starved and battered Swedish army desperately besieges the fort of Poltava. But the scene just before the battle is incredibly grim. While scouting, Charles is shot in the foot by a sniper. And to make matters worse, this happened on June 17th, his own birthday. Talk about a terrible omen, right? The Swedish army is starving. The brutal winter has entirely ruined the quality of their gunpowder, and directly across from them, Peter the Great has arrived with a massive, heavily fortified Russian army.
And if we compare the two major battles side by side, it brilliantly illustrates exactly how the tables have turned. Look at the difference 9 years makes. Back at Narva, you had 9,000 elite Swedes against 40,000 raw Russians. Now, at Poltava, you have 22,000 starving Swedes with basically useless gunpowder facing 80,000 reformed, modernized, and deeply entrenched Russian soldiers. It's the exact inverse of Narva.
The immovable object is finally about to be shattered by the unstoppable force. The Swedes are outnumbered nearly 4-1, but, true to form, the Swedish command decides that their only option is a highly aggressive full-frontal assault.
What follows is a total massacre. The elite Swedish infantry marches right up to the Russian lines, ready to unleash their deadly musket volleys. But because of the ruined powder, their shots barely even reach the Russians. The modernized Russian artillery and infantry simply tear the Swedish lines to pieces. In just 2 hours, the once invincible Karelian army is completely annihilated. Charles XII barely escapes with his life, fleeing south into exile in the Ottoman Empire.
Act 5. A new balance of power. The aftermath of Poltava sent absolute shockwaves across the globe. Honestly, nobody could quite believe what had just happened in the fields of Ukraine. The Duke of Marlborough, observing from afar, penned a letter that perfectly captured the disbelief of Europe. He wrote, "What a melancholy reflection it is that after constant success for 10 years, Charles XII should in 2 hours' mismanagement and ill success ruin himself and his country." The aura of Swedish invincibility was broken forever.
So the crucial point we need to take away from all of this is understanding the concept of hegemony. The Great Northern War wasn't just some regional border dispute. It was a massive battle for hegemony in Eastern Europe. Sweden lost its predominant military status, and Peter the Great firmly established the Russian Empire as a major modern European superpower. He had learned from his defeats, he modernized his state, and he secured his empire's future.
Which brings us right back to our original question, looking at the paths of these two incredible historical figures. Charles XII had tactical perfection, for sure, but it made him rigid. Peter the Great suffered completely humiliating defeats, but they made him adaptable. So the question I want to leave you with today is this. In your own life, will you let your victories make you rigid, or will you let your defeats make you adaptable? Think about that.